Her husband mocked her in court, calling her a burden. But the judge asked one chilling question. Rain tapped softly against the window of the near-empty bus as Eleanor sat in the very back row, her hands gripping a file of legal documents that had just defined the end of her marriage. Her eyes stared blankly out into the dim afternoon, but her mind was still back in that courtroom, back where Victor, the man she had once believed would protect her, had reduced her existence to that of a burden and a dependent parasite in front of strangers and judges. His voice echoed in her thoughts, arrogant and theatrical, telling the court how he had raised her like a child and how she would be helpless without his income. The worst part wasn't just his words, it was the way no one objected. Even her own attorney had hesitated, too overwhelmed by Victor's expensive legal team to intervene with conviction. She didn't cry, not in front of them, but as soon as the wooden doors of the courtroom had shut behind her, her composure cracked. The sound of heels clacking along the marble hall faded into silence while Eleanor found a quiet bench by the vending machines and just sat there for an hour, motionless. Now, on the bus ride home, the file trembled slightly in her lap. Passengers came and went, but no one paid her any attention. She was invisible, just as she had felt during her marriage. Her stop approached slowly, and as the bus rolled to a halt near a modest apartment complex, Eleanor rose, stepped off into the drizzle, and walked with quiet resignation toward a life that had been emptied of security, identity, and worth. Years before, Eleanor had met Victor in the bright lobby of a downtown courthouse, where she worked as a clerk, and he, already a successful attorney, had come to file motions with a mix of confidence and charm. He was older by 10 years, sleek in his suits and sharp in his rhetoric. At first, she had been intimidated by him, his success, his status, his ability to speak with ease in any room. But to her surprise, he noticed her. He complimented her handwriting one day, asked about her weekend the next, and slowly began drawing her into conversations that felt like a privilege. When he asked her out to dinner, she thought she was dreaming. By the time he proposed, she felt like she had been chosen, elevated from a modest life into a realm she never thought she'd touch. The early months of marriage were a swirl of lavish dinners, professional events, and expensive renovations to their new suburban home. But it wasn't long before cracks began to show. Victor disliked when she disagreed with him, even on trivial matters. He corrected her in front of his colleagues. Her opinions were met with silence or patronizing nods. At first, Eleanor blamed herself. Maybe she wasn't sophisticated enough, educated enough, or cultured enough to match his world. She tried to learn. She took classes, watched debates, read law journals. But Victor never seemed satisfied. He would sigh when she mispronounced a legal term, roll his eyes when she asked a question, and, more than once, say with a smile, "Let me handle the smart things, darling." Their house was beautiful. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, pristine countertops, and a walk-in closet big enough to get lost in. But for Eleanor, it began to feel like a museum, cold, curated, and lifeless. Victor worked long hours and rarely came home before midnight. On weekends, he insisted they attend charity galas or networking events, where Eleanor stood beside him like a prop. She'd smile at his jokes and nod along with his stories, even when he exaggerated or spoke as if she were an afterthought. He introduced her not as my wife Eleanor, but as my lovely Eleanor, she keeps the garden blooming. A harmless joke, maybe, but it stung every time. She wanted to be seen as a partner, not a decoration. Eleanor stopped voicing her frustrations after one night, when she'd gathered the courage to confront him. She had told him she felt isolated and unseen, that she missed the man who had once cared about her thoughts. Victor laughed, drained his wine, and said, "You wanted a better life, didn't you? You got it. Stop complaining." That night, she curled up in the guest room, unsure how to answer him. Maybe this was what wealth required: silence, submission, patience. She began to fade from herself, growing quieter, more careful. She took up gardening, not because she loved it, but because it was the one thing Victor complimented her on. He never noticed the books on the shelf she read, the articles she wrote in private, or the job applications she never submitted out of fear he'd belittle her ambitions again. The worst humiliation before the divorce happened at a dinner party Victor hosted for colleagues and clients at their home. Eleanor had spent the entire day preparing the space, arranging flowers, testing recipes, polishing silverware, all to make sure Victor would be pleased. As guests arrived, she welcomed them with warmth and sincerity. But the moment Victor entered the room, he took over with practiced charisma, barely acknowledging her presence. When one of his clients complimented the wine selection, Eleanor humbly mentioned she had chosen it herself. Victor responded with a dry laugh. "Oh, she thinks she picked it. That's cute." Laughter followed, and she felt her face burn as if someone had pulled her skin inside out in front of them all. Later that night, she overheard him in the kitchen, telling a colleague that marrying a woman like Eleanor keeps life simple, she doesn't expect much. The words hit her like a stone to the chest. She went upstairs and locked herself in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub until her legs went numb. It wasn't the insult itself, but the casual cruelty of it, the fact that Victor truly saw her as someone small, someone convenient, someone easy to ignore. That night, she didn't sleep beside him. She watched the city lights blink beyond the glass walls and wondered how she had let herself become invisible inside her own life. Months later, as the divorce proceedings began, Eleanor tried to prepare herself for the battle ahead. But she hadn't understood how brutal Victor would be. His lawyers came with thick files and smug confidence. They painted her as idle, dependent, and emotionally unstable. They claimed she had opted out of a professional life, living off Victor's income by choice, and contributing nothing to the marriage except shopping and gardening. When Eleanor attempted to defend herself, her voice was soft, tentative. She had never been taught to argue. The courtroom was Victor's arena, not hers. Every time she spoke, it felt like her words dissolved before they reached anyone's ears. On the day of the final hearing, Victor stood with his hand in his pocket, smiling as he spoke about her like she wasn't even there. "I gave her everything," he said. "She just never wanted to grow. She's not a partner, Your Honor, she's a dependent." Eleanor sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart pounding like a drum in a storm. She wanted to scream, to throw every memory of every night she spent alone while he worked or partied or disappeared without notice. But no one would believe her. The courtroom wasn't a place for grief or truth, it was a theater. And Victor was playing his part perfectly. The day after the hearing, Eleanor returned to the house for the last time. She was allowed 3 hours to collect personal belongings. The air inside smelled sterile, stripped of warmth. On the mantel sat a ceramic vase, her favorite piece, bought during their honeymoon in Amalfi. As she reached to wrap it in newspaper, her hands trembled. It slipped, shattering into jagged pieces across the marble floor. Eleanor sank to her knees, staring at the broken shards. That vase had survived moves, arguments, and years of neglect, until now. For a long moment, she didn't move. She didn't even blink. It wasn't just porcelain that had cracked, it was the last illusion that anything in this life had truly been hers. Victor appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You break things just like you waste potential," he said, sneering. "Take your junk and go. You're lucky I'm not charging you for emotional damage." She wanted to throw the sharpest piece at him, to leave him with a scar to remember her by, but she didn't. She stood up slowly, looked him dead in the eye, and without a word, walked past him. Each step toward the door felt like a rebellion. She left the broken vase behind, but with it, she also left behind her silence. Back in her small apartment, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the divorce decree. It was a brutal document, lines of ink formalizing her failure in Victor's world. No spousal support, no division of his business assets, not even the car they once picked together. Her lawyer had called it a strategic loss, saying, sometimes, the best win is just getting free. But freedom felt hollow when your dignity was stripped bare in the process. She reread the part where Victor stated under oath that Eleanor had no relevant work experience or earning potential. Those words clung to her like tar. She opened her laptop, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank email draft. There were so many people she had pushed away during her marriage, old college friends, coworkers she never called back, a cousin she used to be close with. But the screen stayed empty. She didn't want pity. What she needed was a plan. She closed the laptop and opened the last drawer of the kitchen cabinet. There, between old receipts and mismatched pens, she found a faded envelope marked ideas. Inside were pages she had written years ago, outlines for articles, drafts of essays, even a letter she once started to a local magazine. Her words weren't dead. They were just buried. Weeks passed, and Eleanor began to look for work. She applied everywhere, from administrative assistant roles to freelance writing gigs, but the gap in her resume and her lack of formal titles worked against her. During one phone interview, a recruiter asked, "So, what have you been doing the last 10 years?" Eleanor replied honestly, "Supporting my husband's career." The silence on the other end felt like a verdict. She knew what they were thinking, useless, dependent, past her prime. Her past sacrifices had become liabilities in the present. Every rejection chipped at her, but none as much as the voicemail Victor left late one night. "I saw your name on LinkedIn," his voice dripped with mockery. "Trying to build a brand now? Eleanor, you were a footnote in my life. You deserve nothing." She replayed it twice, not because she needed to hear it again, but because she needed to feel the burn. That pain sharpened her. She opened her laptop, deleted her timid profile, and started from scratch, this time as who she really was, not who Victor said she was. She returned to court weeks later, not for her own case, but to sit in the gallery. Eleanor wanted to understand how the system worked, how arguments were structured, how evidence was presented. Watching attorneys argue in clean suits reminded her how helpless she had felt in her own hearing. But one day, during a particularly tense session about corporate misappropriation, she noticed something odd. A name came up repeatedly, Cynthia Morales, listed as the recipient of several unexplained wire transfers. Eleanor's ears perked up. She had heard that name before. It was Victor's assistant. Her hands went cold. That night, she dug through old files, emails, even Christmas cards Victor's firm had sent. Cynthia Morales. It wasn't just a name. It was a person who had been in their lives for years, always in the background, always silent. Suddenly, she remembered a conversation Victor once had on speakerphone, laughing about spreading assets in layers like frosting. Eleanor didn't know what it meant then. But now, it felt like a thread, one she couldn't ignore. Eleanor returned to the courthouse the next day, this time not just to watch but to request access to public records. She combed through property deeds, corporate filings, and court documents until her eyes blurred. And there it was, a quiet, almost hidden transaction. A property in upstate New York, purchased under Cynthia's name, funded by an account tied to Victor's firm. It didn't prove anything directly, but it lit a fire in her. She photocopied every page and tucked them into a folder labeled leverage. She didn't know what her next move was yet, but for the first time in months, she felt power humming under her fingertips. As she exited the courthouse, a woman in a gray coat brushed past her, dropped something, and disappeared down the marble steps. Eleanor bent to pick it up. It was an envelope with her name scrawled in elegant handwriting. Inside was a business card and a single sentence: "We should talk, before he buries more." The card belonged to a woman named Elena Riker, a former accountant turned whistleblower. Eleanor clutched the card tightly, her heart racing. The game had just changed. Eleanor met Elena Riker in a quiet coffee shop off a side street near the courthouse. Elena was direct, sharp-eyed, and cautious, traits honed from years spent auditing for powerful men who thought they were untouchable. As they sat across from each other, Elena opened her laptop and showed Eleanor a set of spreadsheets, bank statements, and coded ledgers. Eleanor tried to keep up as Elena explained how Victor had used shell corporations to move assets offshore, often using employee names as fronts. "Cynthia Morales," Elena said, tapping the screen, "is the centerpiece. But she's not the only one." That evening, Eleanor went home feeling overwhelmed yet strangely focused. She realized she would need more than just information, she needed action. The next morning, she returned to courtroom B to observe a civil hearing. The judge presiding over the case, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like gravel, paused after delivering her ruling and glanced briefly at Eleanor in the gallery. It was a simple nod, but it lingered, as if to say, "I remember you." Whether it was pity or acknowledgement, Eleanor wasn't sure. But for the first time, she didn't feel like a shadow in the room. 3 days later, Eleanor was in her apartment, reviewing every legal document from her divorce when the doorbell rang. Standing outside was Cynthia Morales, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Can I come in?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, but opened the door. Cynthia stepped inside, eyes darting as if she expected someone to follow. "I need to talk," she said. "I don't know who else to go to. He's been using my name for years. I didn't even know until the IRS sent me a letter." They sat across from each other in Eleanor's small living room, the space tense with unease. Cynthia explained how Victor had convinced her to sign documents she didn't fully understand, promising internal paperwork for firm accounts. But now, she was facing legal consequences for funds she never touched. "I was stupid," Cynthia said, her voice breaking. "But I'm not going down for him." Eleanor leaned forward. "Would you testify?" The question hung heavy in the air. Cynthia stared at her hands, then gave a slow nod. "If it means taking him down, yes." Cynthia returned the next morning, this time carrying a manila envelope filled with copies of documents Victor had stashed in a locked drawer at the firm. She had swiped them the night before, under the guise of sorting archives. Inside were wire transfer authorizations, memos, even a scanned contract listing Eleanor's name as a silent partner in one of Victor's shell companies, something Eleanor had never signed or agreed to. "He forged that," Cynthia whispered. "He used it to keep certain properties legally inaccessible to you." Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Everything she had suspected was now in front of her, more damning than she ever imagined. The forged contract wasn't just deceit, it was fraud, plain and simple. And now, with Cynthia's testimony, there was finally a trail. She stared at the signature at the bottom of the form, her own name, slightly off, slightly curved in ways she never wrote. Victor had always signed for her when it was just formalities. Now, he had gone too far. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She scanned, cataloged, and backed up every document Cynthia had provided, storing copies in cloud folders and USB drives hidden around her apartment. The next morning, she met Elena Riker again, handing her a flash drive. Elena's eyes widened as she saw the forged documents. "He's not just hiding assets," she said, voice low, "he's committing criminal fraud. If we can validate this with the notary logs and digital records, we can subpoena him." Elena began drafting affidavits and outlining a financial tracing motion to file. But they would need more statements, timestamps, any proof of Victor's behavior beyond the paper trail. "You said he mocked you in court," Elena noted. "How would he respond if you challenged him now?" Eleanor paused, then answered, "He'd laugh, until he realized I'm not afraid of him anymore." That afternoon, she sent Victor a short, calculated message, "We need to talk. You forgot to destroy something." Eleanor walked into the law library that weekend with a different posture. No longer a woman trying to escape her past, she was now preparing to face it head-on. She buried herself in books on civil fraud, post-divorce asset tracing, and affidavit protocol. Terms that once felt foreign now formed sentences in her thoughts. She stayed for hours, taking notes by hand, building a language she had once been told wasn't hers to use. The librarian, noticing her consistency, finally asked, "Are you in law school?" Eleanor smiled, unsure how to answer. "Not yet." That evening, she enrolled in an online pre-law course. It wasn't about becoming a lawyer, at least not yet. It was about understanding the system that had once made her feel powerless. As she studied into the night, she recalled how Victor used to dismiss her attempts to understand his world. "This stuff's too complicated for you," he had once said. But now, with every paragraph she absorbed, every term she defined, she felt that old voice growing quieter, and her own growing stronger. Eleanor waited at the cafe on 5th Street with a stack of papers under her arm and a list of questions in her notebook. She was meeting someone Elena had recommended, a retired forensic accountant named Daniel Frazier. He had worked on high-profile white-collar crime cases and was known for his attention to detail. When he arrived, a tall, thin man with slow, thoughtful gestures, Eleanor noticed his eyes scanned her face carefully before sitting down. "So you're the one Victor underestimated," he said softly, almost like a challenge. Over the next hour, Eleanor laid out what she had: the shell companies, the wire transfers, Cynthia's statement, the forged contract. Daniel listened, occasionally scribbling something in a leather-bound notebook. "He was clever," he said, pointing to the layering of accounts. "But not clean. This is how they get caught. Not in what they hide, but in who they think won't look." Eleanor felt something new stir inside her, not just hope, but validation. She had been dismissed so many times, her instincts questioned even by herself. Now, a stranger confirmed that she had been right to dig. 2 weeks later, Daniel called her with findings. "There's an account in the Cayman Islands, registered to an entity named Delmore Estates," he said. "But there's more, it receives regular deposits from one of Victor's corporate entities, supposedly dormant since before your marriage." Eleanor felt her pulse race. That meant the asset existed during their marriage, and legally, she had claim to it. "How much?" she asked, almost afraid to know. "North of $4 million, Daniel replied. "But here's the catch. He's disguised it as a capital trust through his assistant's father's name." Eleanor stared at her reflection in the window, the city lights blurring behind her. All this time, Victor had been playing chess while she was kept off the board. But now she saw the pieces, the moves, the patterns. And now, she had her own. That night, she and Elena began drafting the motion to subpoena financial records from Delmore Estates, building a case for fraudulent concealment of marital assets. As they worked, Eleanor didn't feel like a victim anymore, she felt like a strategist. At night, Eleanor's apartment lit up with spreadsheets, law textbooks, and sticky notes taped to every surface. She divided her time between online courses and consultations with Elena and Daniel. Every spare hour became a building block. While others watched shows to unwind, she memorized statutes and studied cases where women like her had exposed financial abuse and reclaimed their power. There were setbacks, frustrating gaps in information, nights she doubted herself, but the fear that once paralyzed her had turned into momentum. In her calendar, she marked the day of her upcoming deposition hearing with a red circle. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving to herself that silence was no longer an option. When she practiced her statement in the mirror, her voice no longer trembled. Her hands no longer curled into fists. Victor had always said, "The law protects the smart." He was right. But this time, the smart one was her. It was a cloudy afternoon when Cynthia agreed to meet Eleanor again, this time in a quiet park away from office buildings and surveillance. Cynthia looked thinner, eyes shadowed by stress, but her resolve was firmer than before. "He's getting suspicious," she said, handing Eleanor a flash drive. "He asked me about old files I thought he forgot existed." Inside the drive were internal memos and transaction records between Victor and a foreign consultant, a man previously charged with laundering assets. Eleanor leaned back on the bench, letting the implications settle. "If this goes to court, are you still willing to testify?" she asked. Cynthia nodded slowly. "Yes. I let him silence me too long. I believed him when he said I owed him everything. But he used me, just like he used you. He's not going to do that to anyone else." The women sat in silence, the wind rustling leaves above them. In that stillness, an invisible line was crossed, from fear to resistance. 1 week later, Eleanor and Elena met with a notary to officially record Cynthia's sworn statement. Under oath, Cynthia detailed how Victor had coached her into signing fraudulent forms, created fictitious payroll documents, and diverted client funds. The confession was clear, thorough, and legally binding. When the notary handed back the stamped copy, Eleanor held it with both hands, the paper slightly warm from the machine. "This changes everything," Elena whispered. "This isn't just family court anymore. This could open a criminal investigation." That night, Eleanor placed the confession on her nightstand, staring at it like it was a talisman. She thought back to the early days after the divorce, when she couldn't even speak without second-guessing herself. Now, she held in her hands a weapon powerful enough to take down the man who had humiliated her in front of everyone. And the best part? He didn't even know she had it yet. Eleanor stood before the clerk's desk with her motion to reopen the divorce case in hand. Her request cited newly discovered financial misconduct, asset concealment, and fraud. Elena, standing beside her, gave a subtle nod as the documents were filed. "This isn't just about money," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about setting the record straight." The clerk glanced at the evidence packet, then looked at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. "We'll notify you once a date is set," he said, stamping the page. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor exhaled slowly. The weight of what she had just done hit her, not as fear, but as clarity. This time, she wasn't entering that room as the woman Victor had discarded. She was walking in with facts, allies, and a sworn confession. For months, she had studied the rules. Now she was ready to play. Victor arrived at the reopened hearing with the same confident gait he always had, flanked by a different lawyer this time, younger, flashier. His smile widened when he saw Eleanor seated calmly at the front. "This again?" he muttered loud enough for her to hear. "Some people don't know when to quit." But Eleanor didn't flinch. She watched him settle in, watched the way he adjusted his cufflinks as if the outcome had already been written. He still believed he was untouchable. That would change. As the session began, the judge, now a different one from the original case, asked for opening remarks. Elena stood and calmly introduced the evidence of fraudulent transfers, the forged documents, and the notarized confession from Cynthia Morales. Victor's smile faltered for the first time. His new attorney leaned in, whispering quickly. Across the room, Eleanor's hands stayed still on her lap. She didn't need to say anything yet. The truth was speaking for her. Cynthia took the stand with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each question. She described the forms Victor had instructed her to sign, the accounts in her name she didn't control, and the day she discovered her name was tied to an offshore trust. Victor tried to interject, his lawyer objected on relevance, but the judge overruled. "Let her speak," the judge said, eyes narrowing. "She's under oath." Eleanor watched every word, every glance between the judge and Victor. With each sentence Cynthia spoke, the image Victor had so carefully constructed began to unravel. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw clenched. For years, he had controlled the narrative. Now, the record was rewriting itself in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room went silent as Elena read Cynthia's signed affidavit aloud. The words echoed through the courtroom with the weight of finality. "He instructed me to create payroll documents for fictitious employees. He knew what he was doing. He said, 'No one will look too closely, not if we stay quiet.'" Victor shifted uncomfortably, his face a mask of disbelief. He had expected pushback, maybe even rumors, but not a legal document with his own words quoted verbatim. When Elena finished, she handed the document to the judge, who examined it for a long moment. "This confession, corroborated by financial records, presents serious implications," the judge said. "Mr. Crane, you'll have the opportunity to respond, but be advised that criminal referrals are on the table." The courtroom stirred. Victor's attorney whispered something urgently, but the damage was done. For the first time, Victor was no longer in control, and he knew it. After court adjourned, Victor followed Eleanor into the hallway, his expression twisted with disbelief and anger. "You planned this," he hissed. "You, of all people. You set me up." Eleanor turned to face him. Her voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. I didn't set you up, Victor. You did that to yourself. I just stopped cleaning up after you." For a moment, he looked like a man trying to catch his breath in water far too deep. Behind him, reporters began to gather. Word had spread. The reopened case had drawn attention, and questions were being asked. Victor's attorney urged him to walk away, but he stood frozen. Eleanor stepped aside, letting him pass. This time, he was the one being watched, questioned, doubted. And as the elevator doors closed between them, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, not arrogance, not disdain, but fear. Weeks later, the court reconvened for the final ruling. Eleanor sat quietly, hands steady, her gaze locked forward. The judge entered with a firm expression and a thick binder in hand. After reviewing the evidence, testimonies, and financial records, he began, "This court finds substantial proof of deliberate asset concealment, fraud, and forgery." Eleanor didn't blink. She had imagined this moment too many times to risk missing it by closing her eyes. The judge awarded her a substantial financial settlement, including retroactive alimony and a share of the previously hidden assets. More importantly, he referred Victor for a criminal investigation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Victor's face turned pale. He slumped in his chair, unable to comprehend how his invincibility had shattered in front of everyone. But Eleanor didn't gloat. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming truth. Eleanor returned to her apartment the next morning and began packing. Not because she had to, but because she was ready. She found an old photo of herself from years ago, standing outside her first job, full of dreams and not yet burdened by someone else's ego. She smiled at the woman in the picture, no longer seeing someone naive, but someone brave enough to survive betrayal and rebuild from ashes. She folded the photo gently and placed it in a box labeled Keep. Her new home wasn't extravagant. It was a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood with a small backyard and sunlight that filled the living room each morning. For the first time in years, she bought furniture she liked, painted walls in colors she chose, and planted herbs in a windowsill box. No one hovered behind her, judging. No one rolled their eyes at her decisions. The silence in her home now was not emptiness, it was peace. With part of the settlement, Eleanor established a small foundation, the Second Light Initiative. It was created to support women leaving financially abusive marriages, offering grants for education, legal aid, and housing. She didn't put her name on it prominently. The point wasn't recognition. It was impact. When the press reached out, wanting interviews, she declined most of them. "Let the work speak louder than the wounds," she said once in an article's closing line. At the foundation's launch event, she met women who reminded her of herself, not in appearance, but in the way they carried the weight of silence on their shoulders. Eleanor stood at the podium and shared part of her story. Not all of it. Just enough to let them know that power could return, that voices once buried could still be heard. When she finished, the room was quiet but not cold. It was reverent. One afternoon, a journalist who had followed her case reached out. He wanted her to write something for his paper, not an interview, but a letter. Something that might speak to others in silence. Eleanor spent days drafting it. When it was published, it was titled "To the Woman Who Thinks She's Not Enough." In it, she wrote about invisibility, self-doubt, and how it feels to be diminished by someone who once swore to protect you. She wrote, "They might call you weak for leaving too late. They might call you bitter for speaking up. But they will never understand how much strength it takes to stand where someone once crushed you, and choose to rise." The letter went viral. Women wrote to the paper from all over the country. Some just said thank you. Others said, "I left because I read this." Eleanor didn't respond to all of them, but she read every word. A year later, Eleanor returned to the courthouse, not as a plaintiff, not as a defendant, but as an advocate. She sat beside a woman named Teresa, holding her hand as she prepared to face her own ex-husband in court. Eleanor whispered, "He doesn't own your story." Teresa nodded, her voice still shaky but her spine a little straighter. Eleanor didn't need to speak for her, just to stand beside her. As the judge entered and the case began, Eleanor glanced around the courtroom. It looked the same. The walls, the benches, even the stale air. But everything had changed. She had once walked into this place in shame, drenched in self-doubt. Now, she stood not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who had saved herself. And maybe, just maybe, someone else too.